Doug and I are pleased to welcome you back to the third and final module of Designated Agency Meeting Consumer Expectations. Doug, designated agency has been around as an optional business model in Alberta for a number of years. Why has it been so slow to catch on?
Unfortunately, there have been a number of myths circulating that have led brokerages and industry professionals to believe it was both expensive and difficult to convert from common law to designated agency. I will touch on, and in fact dispel, 5 of the main myths. The first one is that industry professionals will no longer be able to double-end transactions. This is not true, as you can see from the points made earlier. Designated agency ends some of the agency conflicts, not the double-enders. Another myth was that brokerages would have to eliminate shared office space and provide private offices. This is not a requirement. Shared office space, or bullpens, as they are often called, can continue to be used. Confidentiality is at the core of agency, and whether you are in common law or designated agency brokerage, it should not matter. If you are in an open office space and you're going to be discussing a client's confidential information or handling a negotiation, you need to go to a location such as a closing or meeting room where the matter can be discussed in confidence. Rumors were out there that brokerages would have to eliminate office meetings or refrain from discussing listings or buyers' needs. Again, this is not true. Office meetings can continue and listings and buyers' needs can be discussed. But as mentioned before, confidentiality is important, and it does not matter what type of agency model you operate under, the privacy laws are the same. For example, for seller clients, you can still highlight properties, talk about features and value. What you cannot discuss without your client's permission is their motivation, price, or personal information. Take a situation where a seller is going to lose their house to foreclosure if they don't sell soon. You are not at liberty to divulge that to anyone without your client's consent. In this example, it might be in the client's best interest for the other sales staff to know the urgency of the situation. So you could have a discussion with the seller as to the pros and cons of telling the other associates what is taking place. If your seller agrees, you can pass this information along. It is, of course, in the best practice to get the permission in writing. Another myth was that the confidentiality requirements for designated agency are much higher. In fact, there are no differences between common law brokerages and designated agency brokerages when it comes to confidentiality. Provincial, federal, and RECA's requirements around confidentiality are the same for both agency models. Client information must be protected and only shared when required by law or with permission from the client. Transaction files in the brokerage should only be available to those industry professionals involved in the transaction. The last myth surrounds a broker's actions when dealing with an associate who is in concurrent representation or transaction brokerage. Essentially, the broker has to act in this situation as they would when dealing with concurrent representation under the common law. The broker must only give advice to the industry professional that is neutral in nature and cannot favor either the buyer or seller. Here are some observations from an associate now practicing designated agency.
I think amongst realtors there's a lot of misunderstanding about designated agency. I've had numerous conversations from realtors in other offices that talk about their understanding of what designated agency is, and it's not correct. There's a great misunderstanding. Even though we've gone through mandatory courses, we've had people come in and talk to us about certain elements of designated agency. On the whole, most agents have a resistance to it, and the resistance is really on unfounded information or data. It was really easy on the transition for us, and I'd recommend it for any agency or brokerage out there.
Could you describe how designated agency will apply in practice, particularly as it relates to documentation?
The listing process is the same as under common law, with one exception. The seller brokerage agreement names the designated agent as the representative of the seller, the one who will have an agency relationship with the seller. Under common law, it is the brokerage that has the agency relationship. If there is a team representing the seller, the individuals on the team have to be named in the designated agency service agreement. In the case of buyer brokerage in designated agency, a written service agreement must be in place as designated agency contracts out of the common law. As with the listing, the buyer brokerage agreement names the designated agent as the person who has an agency relationship with the buyer. The must versus should initiative the Council is working on will require all brokerages, whether they be common law or designated agency, to have written service agreements in place with all clients. In the instances where a consumer wishes to be treated as a customer, or when it is not appropriate to initiate a client relationship, as discussed earlier, a customer status acknowledgement form should be used.
So Doug, can you talk to us a little bit about the timing of documentation? Is timing important?
Timing of documentation is very important. At all times, consumers should have the process and documentation explained to them before a specific action takes place. This allows for the consumer's informed and timely consent before making a decision. There are three important areas where this comes up most often. The agency relationship guide must be provided and explained before an industry professional gives any advice or confidential information is shared. A designated brokerage agreement must be signed in order for the seller or buyer to become a client, and a transaction brokerage agreement must be signed by the buyer before an offer is written and by the seller before the offer is presented.
So what about record retention, Doug? In a designated brokerage, is it the designated agent's responsibility or the brokerage's responsibility to retain records?
Buyer and seller service agreements are with the brokerage and not the designated agent, just as in common law. It is the responsibility of the brokerage to retain all transaction documents, and it is the responsibility of industry professionals to submit all documents, which includes documents for potential trades, to the brokerage. Industry members must also provide the brokerage with buyer brokerage agreements as soon as they are executed. It is the brokerage's responsibility to ensure designated agents are properly supervised in their representation of the brokerage.
Seems to me, Doug, there's not an awful lot of significant differences between the practice in designated agency and the practice in common law agency.
That's correct. Here's a chart that summarizes the different relationships and documentation. As you can see, the main difference when dealing with buyer and seller clients is that the agency is with the designated agent, not the brokerage. Transaction brokerage happens much less frequently under designated agency, as you only have transaction brokerage when one industry professional or team is representing both the buyer and seller. The provision of the agency relationship guide, client documentation, and how you work with the customers are dealt with the same under both agency models.
Understood. Can you give us a little of the experience of other Canadian jurisdictions in implementing designated agency?
Nova Scotia has taken a similar approach to Alberta in implementing designated agency. They made it available as an optional business model as they felt it should be a business decision of the brokerage, and they believed it is not appropriate for all brokerages. To date, 20 to 25% of brokerages are practicing designated agency, which means about 40% of practitioners in Nova Scotia are designated agents. In British Columbia, the Real Estate Council of British Columbia took a similar position from a regulatory point of view as both Alberta and Nova Scotia. But the Provincial Real Estate Association felt it was important for all of its members to practice designated agency. As of June 1st, 2012, all British Columbia MLS listings must be designated agency. As a brokerage can only practice one model of agency, the designated agency became the default for the majority of brokerages in BC.
So back to Alberta, how would a brokerage go about implementing this change?
From the industry professional's point of view, the main transition issue is dealing with the service agreements with buyers and sellers. This is a fairly straightforward process if the brokerage has planned the transition in an orderly fashion. The first step is to set a date for the conversion of the brokerage from common law to designated agency that is far enough in the future to allow for the necessary steps to take place. When industry professionals are starting to work with new buyer and seller clients, they can explain that the brokerage will be changing its brokerage model soon, and it is necessary to complete two service agreements, one that is common law leading up to the transition date, and another that is designated agency that will line up with the date the brokerage switches to designated agency. A similar process can take place when industry professionals are dealing with extensions of existing service agreements.
So it seems to me, Doug, the biggest changes involve buyer representation as seller representation is much the same as we practice today.
Yes, you're correct. The options on how a brokerage treats buyer agency are numerous. There is a full spectrum of service and representation that can be offered, from an exclusive designated buyer brokerage agreement on one end to a customer status acknowledgement agreement on the other, and everything in between. Two of the objections raised when buyer brokerage gets discussed are buyers not wanting to commit to a brokerage contract and buyers not wanting to be committed to having to pay any commission. Your brokerage has the option of having agreements that do not require a buyer to pay commission, but which can state the brokerage will get paid through the seller. On the issue of buyers that do not want to commit to a brokerage, that can be dealt with in different ways. One is to keep the agreements very short and renew them as long as the relationship is good. Another approach is to sign buyers to non-exclusive agreements, and then they are free to work with as many brokerages as they like.
So that brings us to the end of the third section of Designated Agency, Meeting Consumer Expectations. We'd like to thank you for your kind participation in this program today. Also like to take a moment and thank my colleague Doug Dixon from RECA. Please remember, as you complete the final quiz, you can contact RECA by email through the email link on the page anytime.